Hello, everyone. Welcome back. You're listening to the Torah with Cypora podcast. I am Cypora, and today I have a very exciting and very special guest. She is a Holocaust educator and researcher. She was a researcher for the academic book Witness to History by Ruth Lichtenstein. She worked with Professor Yafa Eliach, a noted Holocaust scholar and writer. I'm so excited to welcome to the podcast Rachel LICHT. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time. I think this is such a great time to talk about the Holocaust now that we're in the 9 days and leading up to Tisha B'Av. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor.
All right. Okay, so the first thing that I want to ask you, and this is actually interesting because in all of my years of teaching, I think about 8 years, I can only remember maybe 2 or 3 times that students asked me a question where I literally froze and kind of had like a brain freeze and had no idea what to answer. And it's interesting because the 2 times that I could remember were both questions that were like so obvious that I almost couldn't come up with something back to say. And one of those times was my students had their Holocaust Remembrance Day. It was when I was teaching elementary school, and they asked me, why do we have to remember the Holocaust? And I remember I just like froze. I was like, wait, I know the answer, but I actually cannot answer. So that's the first thing that I want to talk to you about. Why is it important to remember the Holocaust, to discuss the Holocaust, and to teach about the Holocaust to future generations?
It's a little sad to hear that students would ask that question. After all, the Holocaust, although very, very painful, it's still part of our Jewish history. It's part of the chain of our history of events. And we Jewish people don't shy away from talking about the bad and the good. From the day that we were liberated, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim and we were liberated from slavery, we were told to celebrate the holiday by repeating what happened to us, reading about what happened to us, reading our history. The Haggadah starts with Avraham Avinu, goes all the way back to the beginning of the Jewish nation. So this is part of our history, and it has to be taught. It's also we don't have that many survivors alive today as in previous times. And so it's very important that if we do see a survivor, or we have a survivor, neighbor or relative, we should be aware of what happened to them. Also, it's to preserve memory. It's to remember the people who perished in the war. So it is very important to keep this chain of history going on. We're also told, we're commanded in the Torah to remember what Amalek did to us. Well, we have to remember. And now that you mentioned Tisha B'Av is coming up, it's only been recently in the last few years that kinnis were written by such great people as Rabbi Mandel Zatzal, the Baba Rebbe Zatzal, who wrote kinnis to remember the Holocaust. So I think that this has to be transferred to the children, to the students, that this is part of your history and you have to know it. Yes, it's painful. And yes, it's a struggle to deal with it, but it's part of our history, and we can't just sweep it under the rug and say, okay, I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, and I will say in their defense, they were asking it in good faith. They weren't like, why do we need to learn about it? They were actually genuinely asking. And that's interesting because you're bringing up a point about the importance of knowing our history. And that actually reminded me, I hadn't thought about this for a while. My mother used to teach Jewish history, Hysteria, and she would start out the year posing this question to her students: why do we have to learn Jewish history? And she would tell this story of, she was at a doctor's office, unaffiliated Jewish doctor, and he was asking her, where are your parents from? And she said, my mother's from Lithuania, my father's from Germany. And he said, oh, so you're a survivor. And she said, all Jews are survivors. I think that's the message, and it's kind of what you're saying, right? Is like, we have to learn about our history because we learn about who we are, and Jews are survivors. Kind of what you're bringing up is, the point is, we have to learn about our history. Why do we have to learn about our history altogether is really what the question is. The Jews are survivors, and that's something that we learn when we learn about our history is, kind of what makes us who we are. So that's really beautiful. Is there anything else that you would add about specifically the Holocaust? And you mentioned that as the Holocaust survivors, unfortunately, as time goes on, we have fewer and fewer of them left. Not having survivors, how do you think that that's going to affect the way that we provide Holocaust education, the way that we remember the Holocaust, the way that we teach about the Holocaust?
Uh, you're asking a very vital question for Holocaust history. First of all, you're teaching the Holocaust right after the war. Holocaust studies was not really taught. You didn't have to teach it because most of the survivors, their children, were surrounded by the stories or the silence of the Holocaust. People had numbers on their hands. Children didn't have extended families. They didn't have grandparents. They didn't have a lot of cousins. They didn't have aunts and uncles. So it was and the children carried the names of those who perished. So if you were a child and you say, why is my name Sarah? Why is my name Gittel or Hannah? You might have heard that you had an aunt that was killed in the Holocaust or a grandparent that was killed in the Holocaust. So it surrounded us. At the end of the 20th century, 1990s, it became when the next generation was being educated, it was aware that if we don't teach the third generation, the stories are going to the history is going to get lost. History is made up of the personal stories. We hear like I said, Haggadah starts with Avram, a personal story. Okay, so it's.
I never thought of that. The Haggadah starts with a personal story. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
And it became imperative. The educators felt that if we don't teach it to them, they're going to get the information from the secular world or from movies, from books written by people who didn't experience the Holocaust. So, or even just history books if they're interested in it. So it was very important to bring that in. And those first few years, I imagine every teacher made her student do a genealogy, to interview their survivor relatives and to write something up and put in pictures and all of that. And so that was another thing that's very important. As Jews, we connect to our generations. And this was a way to connect to this generation who suffered so much and who went through so much, and to see their resilience when they were survived and rebuilt after the war.
Yeah.
So the history of teaching the Holocaust sort of went into stages. So at the beginning, you didn't have to teach it because this was all around us. The survivors were there. They were your family. They were your parents. So you knew about it. Then it was brought into schools, and then you would interview your relatives. And now with the survivors, the number diminishing as time goes on, the educators do have a problem of how to. There's nothing like a live survivor to tell you what happened to them. And that, of course, you see the survivor, you hear it from them themselves. So what are we going to do without the survivors? This is a challenge for the next generation of educators. We are working on it. We're thinking of certain ideas. And that's why probably it's even more important to teach it, because you don't have the live survivors. But we do have, for example, we have many interviews that are in archives. And when you watch these interviews, it's a learning lesson, because the people are wearing hairdos from the 1970s or 80s, the clothing, the background. If they're interviewed in their houses, you could see what their houses look like, what houses look like back in the 1980s or 70s when the interview was taking place. So it's also a learning experience that way. I imagine that's what's going to be used much more, is these archival oral testimonies.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying that about the historical piece, because I actually remember I've only been to Yad Vashem one time. It was very intense for me because I'm an intense person. And the first, I think it was the first room that we went into, there was a huge, I remember this huge video screen, probably took up a whole wall, and it was just showing pre-war Lithuania, which is where my grandmother is from. And I just burst into tears. It was like, I felt like there was something like, it was like a time capsule, right? Like seeing regular life, and it was like, oh, this is possibly what my grandmother's life would have looked like, even though she was a kid when, she was almost a baby. She was so young when they escaped. But it was like there was something about seeing just the way that they lived on video was so stark, and it just like really hit me in a different way than I knew I was gonna see Holocaust footage and things like that, but that was like really hit me in a way that I didn't expect. But I'm glad that you brought up about
Can
learning
I
about.
just comment on
Yeah, of
what you just
course.
said, if you don't
Yeah.
mind? Okay, Yad Vashem did that deliberately. You see, when
Oh.
you're teaching the Holocaust, you can't just walk into Jews as victims, Jews, the
Mm,
pictures of the skeletal Jews, and so on. You have to remind your students, or you don't have to remind, you have to teach them that there was a life before, a very vibrant Jewish life
yeah.
before the Holocaust. Like you said, these were people. Your great grandmother was it that your great grandmother was a baby, or your great
My grandmother.
grandparents? Yeah,
Yeah.
was a baby. They had families. They were teenagers like the students you're teaching. They went to
Yeah.
school. They had dreams of becoming or doing things. They played. They went on vacation. Yes, there were poor Jews. There were Jews that were rich. And of course, we have to remember, if you take a look, all of our great religious institutions, our scholarly institutions. Let's say you take a yeshiva like Mir. What is that yeshiva called today? Mir. What is Panovich called today? Panovich. It's a
Right.
continuation. Okay, and among the Hasidic dynasties, it's interesting to call somebody the Satmar dynasty. Satmar was a town in Hungary. Why don't we call it the Williamsburg dynasty? That's where they live, or Monroe dynasty today. But we don't. It's the continuation. There was a life before. And that's very important when you're teaching Holocaust. You just don't jump into the horror. You jump in to show they had, quote, what we would call a normal, happy lives, vibrant lives. Like I said, there were poor people, rich people. I'm sure there were sad people, people with problems, just like today in New York. They are beautiful. Look at their clothing. Look at their carriages they had for their children. Not very different than what we have today. So you just obviously were more advanced. They didn't have maybe like a computer or a cell phone or a smartphone, but they had telephones, and they had more newspapers more Jewish related newspapers than we have today in New York even. So this was a very vibrant community, and that's
Yeah.
what was destroyed. You have to remember that too. It wasn't only the people, it was a whole way of life and a destruction of communities, schools, yeshivas. Torahs were burned, books. What happened to all our books, our Jewish books? Think about it.
Yeah.
Every home has books. What happened to all those books? So you have to start first with what a vibrant life it was before the war, and then then you could appreciate what we lost.
Yeah, I mean, as even as you're describing that, I'm feeling myself get choked up again, which I did
I'm
not
really
count on for this interview that I might cry, which I don't know why I didn't think of that because I always cry about everything Holocaust related. But as you were describing that with all of that imagery, it just really hit me the same way as when I walked into Yad Vashem. It's like that same thing of just humanizing, right, in a very real way. There's something that's interesting, like when somebody hears that something tragic happened to somebody, they always want to know the details. Why? Because you want to try to create distance, right, between yourself and that person. Like, oh, well, they, weren't doing XYZ, like this safety precaution, but I'm always right. Like it's like a natural human thing to do. And I think with the Holocaust, it's so important to just really, really let ourselves experience. Like there was a whole life in your, there was real life. There was a society there. There were real people. There were families. All of that. Like they were just like us, they were just regular people. And actually, now that I'm saying that, I'm remembering when I was there, that was actually something that also hit me, that I was thinking about was like, oh, they were just like me. It wasn't like other stories that we hear in our history as Jews, where there was like generations of persecution, even like Mitzrayim, something like that. It was like just regular society. They were living in democracy, during times of democracy. They, were just regular, regular people in a Western country. It's so unfathomable, but it really brings down to earth, humanizing those people. And actually, I also was thinking, as you said, that's exactly counter to what the Nazis did. The Nazis tried to dehumanize them. So I think it's so important to counter that by starting out and saying, no, 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 no. These were regular people just like you,
That's another thing that Yad Vashem does, and I'm sorry, it was they brought it to America. From the very beginning, Yad Vashem wanted to collect the names of those who perished, and when they would interview, and we've been doing it even among like a Buddha also tries to collect names where you fill out a form of the names of your relatives or people that perished, information about them, their name, the names of their parents, if they were married and they had children, the names of their spouses and the names of children, if where they perished, if it was in a camp or if they starvation, and where did they live. And so far, from what I understand, there's over 4 million names collected. And the Yad Vashem put it into this huge book where you could turn the pages. So if you go, it's called the Book of, I think, Life, or no, it wouldn't be called the Book of Life, but it's called the Book of something. And during the winter this past year, the book was brought to the United Nations. We're in the lobby, you could walk in, and I saw people. I was there, and they had their pads with their names of the people, the relatives that perished, and they would look it up in the book. It's alphabetically, and it's amazing how many people were called Friedman, how many people were called Klein, the common Jewish names, and you have the dates and when they were born. It was a very powerful to see how, when you see their names in this book. So I would even advise, if anybody has not filled out the names of relatives that perished, you should. That's one way that we could remember them.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention the UN, because some countries in the UN, it's like as they are presenting this book and saying like remembering the Holocaust, at the same time, countries are either denying or trying to rewrite history, specifically related to the Holocaust. I was hoping you could speak on that. I know there's some things going on in Poland specifically. Can you talk about what's going on there?
Okay. All right. Yes, we have this problem especially with the internet, with the social media. We have this problem with Holocaust deniers. There are groups of people that they write on the social media, and so on. As an educator, I don't concern myself with them. These are people who, you can't speak to them in a proper way. They have their ideas. There's no point in trying to convince them that there was a Holocaust. It's a waste of time. So it's waste of energy and waste of time.
But I will say, sorry to interrupt, that it's really interesting to me. It's conspiracy theorists, basically, these Holocaust deniers, and like one of the most famous conspiracy theorists was Hitler. Like Mein Kampf was a conspiracy theory that was disseminated, and maybe at first wasn't thought of and as a legitimate thing, but look what it led to. So it's just really almost like, in a tragic way, it's kind of ironic that that's
That's a very good point. I didn't think about it, that he also was a conspiracy. But the other point that you mentioned was about rewriting history. And that is a problem, because, you know, if something is rewritten, something you read something in a history book, you tend to believe it's true. And if there are countries that their policy is to make sure that the story of the Holocaust that happened in their countries is portrayed in, let's say, a positive way. To give you an example, let's say Poland, you mentioned Poland. Okay, there were over 3.5 million Jews living in Poland. And during the interwar years, between World War I, World War II, Poland probably had more anti-Semitism than Germany did.
Yeah.
Until Hitler came to power, there was anti-Semitism in Germany, but it was considered a very good country for Jews to live in. And
Yeah.
in Poland, it was Poland that was the country that had all of this hatred towards the Jews. And there were laws against the Jews. And before Hitler even put in quotas in universities or expelled Jews from the university, Poland did it. So Poland has a history of anti-Semitism. So when the war broke out, it is true that it was the Germans, the Nazis that came into Poland. And it's true, they built the ghettos, they made the concentration camps. That is true. But there is no deny that there are books written, there is documentation that the Poles were collaborators, that the Poles did, especially in the small towns and villages, there are new scholarship being written. Nazis that come into a small town and village don't particularly know where all the Jews are and who is Jewish. It was the neighbors of the Jews that pointed it out. And the Germans encouraged them by giving them a pound of sugar, some vodka, maybe a little money, and they went on Jew hunts to find Jews. And this has been documented. Now, in Poland, and of course, Jan Gross, the very famous historian, wrote the book Neighbors, where he documented that in a small town of Yad Vashem, which is in eastern Poland, the Nazis didn't even arrive there yet in 1941, and they rounded up their Jews, and in a horrific manner. They put some in a barn and burned down the barn with the Jews inside. They threw Jews into the water, into a stream, a lake that was nearby, a river that was nearby. And this was documented. So, and yet the Poles are rewriting history. If I'm not mistaken, they passed a law saying if you accuse Poland of Holocaust atrocities, you could go to jail. So you could be punished up to, 2 or 3 years. You have to pay a fine. So writing history in Poland today, nobody's going to do research. No Polish historians and scholars are going to do research because they can't do it. They'll be punished. So that's, a one way. They also built a museum towards the righteous Gentiles. Now, it's true. Poland has the largest number of righteous Gentile awards given by Yad Vashem. That is true. But if you study their stories, for example, let me just give you one example. There was a man called Joseph Alma. He lived in a very small town called Makova. He had a wife and 6 children, and she might have even been pregnant, and he hid some Jews. They were discovered, and punishment for hiding Jews was the Polish family's whole family would be executed, which they were, along with the Jews. So today they built a museum, not exactly in the house that he lived in a distant area, and they tell the story of how he gave his life to save the Jews and his family's life. But they leave out the part who denounced them. The Polish policemen that came with the Germans, who denounced them. So it turns out to be some of his Polish neighbors. But they realize that doesn't sound good. So it becomes a Ukrainian that denounced them. So when you study these stories, and here's this museum where people children are taken to, school children, and it's on the visitor's map. If you go to Poland, you must go see the museum of this righteous Gentile. Now, that's true, he was, but he was denounced by his fellow Polish citizen. And this was not uncommon. So again, this is rewriting history, okay? And that is dangerous.
Yeah, it's so unbelievable that a country just, would deny their participation in in the Holocaust. It's just um it's hard for me to wrap my mind around it, like it's
It
and
has to do with identity. The Polish people, they're very nationalistic. They're very proud of their identity, and they feel, and it's true. They were invaded. Their country was invaded. They put
right.
up a very strong fight against the Nazis.
It's
There
like
were
a
over
technicality, though, because like I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about the Holocaust as you are, obviously. And even I know, like, it's just a known thing of any Jews that know about the Holocaust, that the Polish people, like what you were saying, the informants, they were so, so horrible to the Jews. Like, it's just something that's known. Um,
Yes, but for every Jew that was saved, there was a good Polish for all of these Polish righteous people.
yeah,
So, yeah, and I can understand they don't want this black mark in their history because they're very proud. And they say they suffer too, which is true. Over 3 million Poles were murdered. Their whole intelligentsia class, as soon as the Nazis came in, the first people they really, besides the Jews, they targeted the Polish intelligentsia class, and they killed the professors, anybody that could lead, become leaders or resistance fighters. They did kill. So it's they tell a joke that if in Poland, well, it's not such a joke, but if the Nazis wanted to capture, let's say, a Jew and he was running away from them, they would say, "Oh, there goes that Jew," and Polish people would try to catch him because they know they'll get some sort of prize. If somebody was a resistance fighter and he says, "I'm a resistance fighter," all the Poles would come out and try to hide him from the Nazi. So there was two societies here. It was the
right.
Poles and it was the Jews. And Jews, it's a right, And of course, if you look at post-war Poland, where you had the pogroms post-war in Kielce, where you had more than 46 survivors being killed, men, women, and children. Okay, so how do you they have to they own up to that, and they're not.
Yeah. You mentioned the Hasidei Umos Ha'olam, specific people throughout the war that, did tremendous things to save Jews, risked their own lives. I was hoping that we could highlight specifically the story of Tsugihara. That's somebody that is known, but is not nearly as known as I wish he was, because it's an incredible story, and my family was saved by Tsugihara. So I was hoping that you could tell that story of who he was and what he did.
Okay. Thank you for the question because he's back in the news. I was surprised to
Oh,
read that people are challenging the story to a certain degree, and that's another.
wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was in the news. It was just a minor mention. I assume there's going to be some historian that's going to look into it and come out with some sort of, wrap up the story and say exactly what happened, how much credit he should get. I think that's the problem. You see, what happens also is that someone like Schindler, a movie's made out of him. There's
Yes, I want to talk about that
Yeah.
soon.
Okay, so let's stick first to Tsugihara. Okay, let's talk about him. When the war broke out in 1939, what most people did, there was at the end of August of 1939, there was the Ribbentrop and Molotov. That was the Russian Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact, which stated, people read about it, were shocked because Hitler always said that he's going to save the world from the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks they're the biggest enemies. And of course, all Jews are Bolsheviks, all Bolsheviks are Jews. So that was part of his propaganda. So when this non-aggression pact was saved at the end of August, I think it was like August 23rd or something like that, the world was in shock. But they did not know about, well, Hitler did this because he wanted to invade Poland and he didn't want to have to fight on two fronts. That's a separate thing. But what we did not, the people at the time did not know, is that Poland was going to be divided up, and part of Poland was going to be given to the Soviet, the part that they had before World War I, that they lost after this is what the Soviets lost after World War I. Now, the Soviets were not out to commit genocide. They wanted everybody to be good communists, period. As long as you were a good communist, they, fine. But, which of course was a problem for all religious Jews, but otherwise fine.
Yeah.
When it divided up and the Nazis, so a lot of people fled towards the Soviet-occupied Poland, which included Lithuania. At that time, the Soviets, at the very beginning, they allowed Lithuania to be still independent. So many yeshivas fled to Lithuania, thinking they could reestablish themselves there. Many well-known Jewish leaders fled to Lithuania, to Vilna. Rabbi Chaim Ozer was still alive at that time, and he helped them. So they were there, but most people knew that you got to get out. You don't want to live under the Soviets. You don't want to live with the Nazis if they show up. So many Jews tried to leave, including the yeshivas, like Mir Yeshiva. So these two Dutch yeshiva boys, young men, I should really say, they met with this consulate, who was really a replacement consulate because the ambassador went back to Holland. They told them, look, we need to go someplace. And he gave them an end visa, meaning to Curacao, the islands of Curacao. And he mentioned you really don't need a visa to go to Curacao because it's really up to the discretion of the governor there. When they heard that, they said, would you give visas to our classmates? And he said, yes. And they said, could you leave that part out of the visa, saying it's up to the discretion of the governor? Just say no visa required for Curacao. So he said he was willing to do it, which is really not legal, but he was willing to do it because he understood the situation. Word spread very much among all these Polish refugees that entered Vilna and Kovna, which is the capital of Lithuania at that time. And they said, everybody wanted this visa. So he did distribute this visa, an N visa, to Curacao, and it said visa not required. So he stamped their papers, visa not required. So they have one piece of paper that they need. Now they realize they can't go west because it's not Nazi-occupied Europe. So they have to go east. And one of the places east out of Russia would be Japan. So that's when they all showed up one day. A lot of them showed up when Mr. Tsugihara describes it. He opened up his windows, his curtains in the morning, and there was hundreds of these Jews. Eventually he realized they were Jews, men and women standing at the gate of the consulate. Now, Tsugihara was the consulate of Japan in Kovna, Lithuania. He was also a spy. That's what they used to do, consulates. They would spy and let their home country know what's going on. Now, he heard what's happening to Jews, and they explained to him that they need a transfer visa through Japan. They're going to Curacao, and they just need a transfer visa. At first, he asked his government, should he stamp their papers, and the government said no. But he didn't listen, and he did stamp. So he stamped the papers of your grandmother, your great-grandparents, and hundreds of yeshiva boys, hundreds of other people who heard about it. And he stamped their papers saying that they could transfer through Japan. And what he did was, no question about it, he saved them. If he wouldn't have stamped the papers, they wouldn't have been able to transfer through Japan. But you have to throw in something else. You got to get an exit visa. That means you have to go to the communist Soviets, and tell them you want to leave Mother Russia. And usually when you tell the Soviets you want to leave Mother Russia, you get a one-way ticket to Siberia. So this was
and that's actually what happened to my other grandmother. from the other
Okay,
side.
so
Yeah.
it was like a miracle. Nobody could understand it. Why they allowed this whole group of Jews, several hundreds, if a thousand, among them the Mir Yeshiva, among them, like you say, your great grandparents and grandmother, and among them, even to, like Rabbi, the Amshina Rebbe, a man with a long white beard, or a little beard. I don't know if it was white at that time, and there was a beard, and he allowed, and they said yes. Now, there's another problem. It costs money to get onto a train, and it'll cost money to hire a boat and pay for the boat ride to Japan. So here you have another group of people stepping in in the story of rescue. So you have the Joint, which was an American organization, New York based organization that provided financial aid, and you, of course, they had the Sternbuchs in Switzerland that provided aid. So then after the war, and we know the rest of the story, they ended up in Kobe and then to Shanghai. Okay, fine. After the war, nobody paid attention to Mr. Tsugihara. Even when he returned to his home country, he couldn't get back his job. He was a minor official. He looked for work. It was many years later when people got interested in Holocaust, and every country wanted to portray themselves as being just Sadiqim. They were very righteous through the war. They never killed the Jews. These countries were trying to portray themselves as such. Japan, who had a terrible history of how they treated the Chinese people, how they treated American POWs, they felt, here we got an opportunity. And here's Mr. Tsugihara. And they built him up. Now, he deserved it. But for example, they built a monument in a place where he never lived, and they claimed he lived in this place. They built monuments all over that became tourist attraction, also money making.
Wow.
They made sure they
Yeah.
worked with the Israeli government to make sure he gets righteous of Gentile. He does deserve righteous of Gentile. But what about the rest of them who were involved in it? So they're trying to show that Holocaust is being used for political reasons, like in Poland. It's used for financial reasons to make a little for tourists. So I think that's what they're looking into it, that he was a writer. He did sign those papers. He did stamp them. So, and he did look, your evidence, your great-grandparents, your grandparents were able to get out of Lithuania with Tsugihara papers.
Yeah.
So let's give him his due and leave the man alone and give him his respect and make sure you know the story. That's why it should be taught.
Yeah. There's one part of the story of Tsugihara that there's like a really strong visual, which was the last couple of days. Can you talk about that? The last few days before
he was expelled from the country. The Soviets expelled him, and he was still writing papers from the train window and so on. And if I'm not mistaken, many years later, after he passed away, they brought his wife and son to Mir Yeshiva, where all the Rabbanim, the Gedolim, hosted Mrs. Tsugihara and her son, and they thanked her again for saving, giving them the papers and saving them. And it's very emotional. I think you could probably find it somewhere as a clip somewhere. And it was very emotional. And I think they even have a little plaque somewhere near the Mir Yeshiva, near the tree or something, remembering Mr. Tsugihara. So rightly deserved. But keep in mind, others played a role too.
Yeah. But I mean, I just wanted to highlight that story because specifically, my family, and I'm sure other people listening, anybody who escaped with the Mir Yeshiva and others, as you mentioned, he just saved so many lives. But the thing that really stands out to me about that story is that we can talk about it now and we're like, wow, what a hero. It's like so obvious and so clear that he was a hero, because he was. But he was disgraced. He was told by his peers, probably his superiors as well, at that time, he was not, what he was doing, a lot of people would have looked at and thought he was breaking the law, he was going against whatever the country's ideals were. And now we look back on it and we're like, he's a hero. The point is that you have to think for yourself and do what's right. You're not going to, because what's considered right has changed historically, like on a societal level, on a governmental level, but what's right and wrong is what's right and wrong.
But still, during the Holocaust, many people did wrong, what we would consider wrong, but they did it to survive. So
Yeah.
again, you see,
Well,
no pride. Yeah,
that's a
that's a
different
different
conversation.
pride. You can't say you have to always do the right thing. Sometimes you have to do something that might be considered wrong in a different time, in a different place, but it was right then because, and that's why we can't do any judgment of how Jews, uh, you know, behaved or whatever. Like
Yeah.
even like something simple, to eat on Yom Kippur, it's wrong to eat on Yom Kippur. But during that time, it was very correct because you had to save your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be careful about putting value judgment.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned Yom Kippur. My great grandfather, it's just a story in our family that when they were escaping with the Mir Yeshiva, there was one day where they were close to the international date line, and they actually weren't sure which day was Yom Kippur. So the Rabbanim around, they just determined one of the days. They weren't sure between 2 days, and that was the day that everyone fasted. And my great grandfather actually fasted both days because he just wanted to be sure that he was fasting no matter what. So that's a story in our family that we're obviously very proud of what he did.
This would be another reason to teach the Holocaust. Stories
Yes.
like what your grandfather did is not found in your textbooks or your academic books or regular secular history books that tell the story of the Holocaust. It might not even be found in museums that you visit. And that's another reason you have to tell your history. And I always say you have to tell the history. One way you could do it through Jewish eyes. You have to look at it as that the Holocaust is part of our Jewish history with Jewish eyes. You take a look, let me give you an example. Every book, every museum, everybody talks about July 22nd, 1942, because it was the great deportation from Warsaw. Unless you look up the date, what day was July 22nd? Second, it was Erev Tisha B'Av. It was Tisha B'Av. And we know from our tradition and studies that Tisha B'Av tends to have terrible things happening on that day.
Yeah.
Both Beis Hamikdash were destroyed, right? What was that? The Crusade, something with it. But here you have the destruction of Polish Jewry, who've been in Poland for over 1,000 years. Jews have been living in Poland over 1,000 years, and it's gone in 3 months. So it was Erev Tisha B'Av. So you have to approach like the story of your grandfather. It has to be explained that what the international date line is, how we don't know the exact date. You have to fast on the exact date, and why the Rabbanim picked one day. And your great grandfather, was a man who really his soul was connected to God in such a way that he said, I'm not taking a chance. I'm going to do both days, even though I'm sure he was very hungry at that point. All along, there wasn't enough food as it was.
Right.
So that has to be taught. And I think that's what the children, we don't want, in my opinion, everybody knows the horrors of the Holocaust. Everybody knows the brutality. Everybody knows the number. 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children. So everybody knows that. It's these kind of stories that we have to tell, that they should know, because that is our history.
Yes.
The brutality of the Nazis is not my history. It's your great grandfather's story, and others like it. There were other people that fasted in concentration camps, in ghettos on Yom Kippur, okay? And did try to perform all the commandments, Hanukkah, Rosh Hashanah, Seder, trying to bake a little matzah. We have all these, and that's what we should know, and that's what we should teach.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you explained that, because I think that it's such an important thing to talk about. What, from a Torah perspective, the resistance against the Holocaust was the spiritual resistance, right? Like, that's what we consider resistance. And
exactly. And this is also something that was left out. in many museums and books after the war. The Orthodox community, the religious community, was not taken into consideration as much as more of the secular Jews or assimilated Jews, or what they did, what they accomplished, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was very heroic and all that. And you could debate whether they should have done it, they shouldn't have done it. I say I don't like making judgments when I study the history, but talk about the one who gives away their piece of bread to another person when you're starving,
Yeah.
and keeps that other person alive for another day, maybe.
Yeah.
So
last Tisha B'Av, I watched Schindler's List finally.
Yeah.
And I don't want to take away from what that story that was being told, and I know that in the context historically it was really groundbreaking. That was the first major Holocaust based film, and so I understand that I'm looking at it out of context. Like I watched it in 2022, after so much literature and so many movies have been portrayed about the Holocaust, and even just education. But one thing that really struck me about the movie, and this is what I want to talk to you, not just specifically about Schindler's List, but just in general, movies and books that are written about the Holocaust, something that really struck me was, as much as I did learn from it about Schindler, that story, and, like I said about Tsugihara, I wish somebody would make a film about Tsugihara. Like, I'm glad that that story was told. But something that really struck me was, like, I felt like, knowing what I know about the Holocaust, number one, as much as they did show a little bit of the brutality of the Nazis, it, like, didn't come close to the really sadistic, the games that they would play, the really despicable way that the Nazis treated the Jews. I didn't think it even, like, came close to what I know to have actually happened. Another thing that really struck me was that I know that something that really defined the Holocaust is how starving everyone was. I understand that they can't, they're actors, like, what should they do, I guess, but, like, I really just couldn't help but notice that the characters were healthy looking, and that was, like, something that any documentary, any photos, anything I hear about the Holocaust was just how starving they were. That really, like, was something that I noticed. So I'm curious what you think about the accuracy of either Schindler's List or just Holocaust movies or books in general, and what your thoughts are on those things, because I know that you mentioned earlier that we should learn from the real people and not through movies and books. So,
right, a couple of correction comments on what you said. Schindler's List was not the first film made on the Holocaust. Back in the days, I think it might have been like in the 70s. There was on television, it was shown in Germany even, there was a series called The Holocaust. I think Meryl Streep might have even been a famous actress, might have been in it. And it told the story of two families, one Jewish family, one German family, how they were friends before the rise of Hitler, they socialized. And once Hitler came, how the non-Jewish family, many of the members became Nazis, and what happened to this family and their relationship. And it was one of the first, movies or media that was done on the Holocaust, and it was on television. And those days before computer, the social media, all of that, that's where most people got their entertainment, and it was shown in Europe, and it was really written about a lot, and it was considered like the first one that opened up the eyes of the younger generation in Germany. Now, there were many films made on the Holocaust.
You're not talking about Sophie's Choice,
there is a
right?
film made.
Are you talking?
No,
okay.
that's
Meryl Streep was in
completely,
that.
that's completely, but Okay, you said they should make a film on Tsugihara. There is. PBS made a film on
Oh,
Tsugihara, and I would recommend if you could get it. I sometimes show parts of it to the class because they do have some pictures, so they see what Tsugihara looked like. You see pictures of the Jews standing outside his house. So there are that's a good film if you want to watch something on Tisha B'Av about Tsugihara.
yeah,
Now, Schindler's List was made by Steven Spielberg. Now, he's probably considered one of the greatest filmmakers of this time.
sure.
It's He's from Hollywood. It's entertainment to a
Yeah,
point. Yes, it's a story, but Hollywood makes their money on entertainment. That's the definition of Hollywood. We
right.
entertain you, you pay us, and you enjoy yourself in the entertainment. Now, it is true what you say about starvation, but it depends where. It's true that in the ghetto, in Krakow ghetto, and later on in Plaszow camp, they were starving. There's no question about it. They were starving. But the ones that joined with, who became Schindler's Jews, they worked for him. And if you worked, you did get some food. Even the Nazis would give you food if you were working. It was very little and it wasn't enough, but there was. Now, why didn't he portray them as more stark? Again, you can't scare your audience. You don't want them to go out with nightmares.
Yeah,
This is entertainment. His message was, here is this man who is able to save all these Jews. He was a hero, like you said. To him, it was like really, he didn't understand what was going on. And it became like an obsession. He's going to save his Jews. And
yeah,
he did. You should know he's buried in Eretz Yisrael.
yeah,
Many people go to his keva, to his thing, and mine to say something, because he did save these people who went on to have families and generations. He had many qualities that were not very, laudable. He was a womanizer.
yeah,
He stole, he went to jail, I think, because he once kissed a Jewish girl on her birthday, one of his things. They thought he was stealing money.
yeah. They
Which
show some of that in the movie.
yeah, so they do want to portray him that he's not this angel, that he's like what you said before. He's a man like many other people, and he decided to save them. Now, he didn't wake up one morning and say, I want to help Jews. It just fell into a certain thing when he saw what was going on. It repelled him, and you say, I want to do something. He was able to do it. So Schindler's List became very popular among people. It won, I think, won an Academy Award, if I'm not mistaken,
I think so.
more than one probably. So this is popular Holocaust entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, I got chills when you said it's there to entertain you. I just never thought of it that way, but I think you're right. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. And, this is a particular story that's being told, and it was made by a Jewish person. And so that's a different story. But I'm bothered when I see fiction, like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, for example, or things like that, where I'm like, the Holocaust was so tragic, and there are so many true stories that have still never been told. I find it upsetting when people will use the Holocaust as their creative outlet, if you will.
Or the backdrop of a romance, or as a backdrop of a romance story.
Yeah,
Not that there weren't. There were many, many romance stories during the Holocaust.
I'm
But The
sure.
Boy in the Striped Pajamas should be, I'm not for cent, but it should never be used in an educational purpose. There's no educational value to it. You're right. If you're teaching the Holocaust, if anybody's out there teaching the Holocaust, you should just use documentaries, use eyewitness, oral testimonies, eyewitness reports. And today there is a lot. If you go to the various sites, you could get clips of oral testimonies. You could get a lot of documentary footage, and you should not have to turn to what Hollywood produces, even if it is. Look, I saw Schindler's List. Everybody who saw it was very impacted by it. So on one hand, that's good. At least there's an awareness about what happened to the Jews, even if not to the extreme that you want it to be, but there's an awareness to it, and that you could do good that there are people that do good, right? And people should be among the people in that group of people that do good. That should be the lesson. And if that's the lesson from Schindler's List, that's what people get out of it, then kol hakavod, then fine, use it. But like I said, and like you said, there's enough material that you don't have to turn to Hollywood produced films unless it is a documentary. And there are enough documentaries around that you could use for educational purposes or learning purposes, or on a day like that Tisha B'Av, if you want to connect to what happened to the Jews during the war.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end it, which is basically, I love that message that if you want to learn about the Holocaust, you should go to learn about people's stories and hear their stories, and hear about the actual people and what they went through. And I think that, their stories are our story, right? It's just all part of our story of survival, and our story of spiritual resistance. Anything else that you want to say? Any last message?
Just, I'd like to thank you very much for having me, giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.
I'd like to wish all of Klal Yisrael that this Tisha B'Av should really bring the Mashiach, and we could definitely use him. And we should just, it's trying times. The Rabbanit Shalom should continue to take care of us.
Amen. Thank you so much for coming on again. This was such a privilege to be able to talk to you, and thank you so much for educating me and my listeners. I'm sure everybody's going to learn a lot from today, so thank you. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Torah with Cypora podcast. As always, don't forget to share the show with your friends, leave a 5-star rating and review, and, of course, always be kind, stand up for truth, and think for yourself. See you in the next episode. Bye, guys.